Okay, I might as well introduce it then. Hello, everyone. It's been a while. It's been what do they say? A bit of a gap between drinks or something? Is that how the saying goes? Um, yeah, we've had a break and we're back, and we haven't gotten far away from where we started, it seems. We're back with Plato and the Meno, which actually is one of the first ones we actually read. So that was like nearly 5 years ago, I'm guessing. So welcome everyone, and yeah, how do we want to start off? Who's running the show?
Travis, I knew you were keen. Did you want to kind of kick us off?
Yes, for sure. So to introduce this one, Meno is one of the older works, well, written later on in Plato's timeline. Quite an accessible book. Starts off straight away with, well, what does it mean to be good? And then it follows through with a discussion around, well, how do we define it? That brings us into, a good discussion around definitions, importance, come into what does it mean to remember, come into the square to show how we might even be able to coach someone along, and then we come into an aspect around knowledge. So it brings in a lot of different themes within the book. I quite enjoyed it and picked up a lot as well on the second read through, just around some of what I thought might be some key concepts that are tucked away, particularly towards the end of the novel, especially around the idea of like a hypothesis as well. But yeah, lots of different thoughts on that and around where the discussion ended up. But any other general comments?
Yeah, I think that's a great intro, Travis. I'd only add that I'd say that there's probably two main themes that people tend to associate with this dialogue. And the first one is that you've alluded to the famous demonstration with the slave, a household slave, about how people have innate ideas about geometry, and that leads to Socrates putting forward this idea that learning is in a sense recollection. And the other theme, which of course is intertwined with that more specific one, is this general idea around can virtue be taught? Well, first of all, what is virtue? And secondly, can it be taught? And that theme kind of threads all the way through. But along the way, we get so many gems, like basically and we actually start right in medias res. We jump right into it with Meno, and Meno is this very kind of he's a bit of a megastar. He's this powerful person from a sort of provincial city in Larissa in Thessaly, but he's got connections, and at the start he's being a bit patronizing towards Socrates, to be honest. And then and he comes out and says, "Look, I've been giving talks about virtue for quite some time, and to large groups of people." And then it gradually emerges he doesn't actually have that good of an idea of what he's doing. So this is one of those wonderful dialogues where Socrates kind of demonstrates uh, not only that with the household slave knowing really how to do geometry, but also the master of the house, Meno, who's been giving all these talks about virtue, isn't really that cluey at all. So yeah, there's these dynamics going on, and it's just wonderful.
And it's good to see as well, interwoven through this is references to the other works of Plato. And that's what I really am coming to enjoy is when it was sat down to be penned, all of these different books, there must have been this grander vision in play because these ideas are picked up either in other works or we reference other works. And then those same people are kind of present in at least some of them in this particular one, and then in others as well. So the Gorgias is mentioned, Phaedrus, particularly if we're talking about the soul. So that's been really cool to have a look at.
And I was just going to make one quick comment before we get into it that Judith, you're just saying that Meno was known to have been giving lectures on virtue. Is that correct?
Well, he says that, and
Yeah,
he says that in yeah.
yeah, he says
He
that in
comes
the
out and says
text.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah, he
but
comes
it's
out and says he's giving these talks to large groups of people about virtue. And then
mm,
later on in the dialogue, if you recall, Socrates kind of comes back and he picks up on that and he's making the point, well, maybe he didn't actually know what it was.
we know that because the first thing he says is Meno asking the question. So, Meno asking Socrates straight up. So already we start from we're starting from that position of ignorance because he's asking for someone that says that he has lectured in virtue. He's starting off with a very broad question about that
He is,
very.
but yeah, but I think Jody, and this is kind of, I think he's not actually. I think he's, and this is another thing that, of course, comes out later with the slave and the geometry. Socrates reminds us after that encounter, it's actually better to be in honest confusion than to be confidently wrong. And
Mm,
confidently wrong is how Meno starts out here.
mm,
He's kind of asking Socrates, can virtue be taught? But you can see that he thinks he knows what the answer is, because he's actually quite taken aback because when Socrates says, and it's right on this first section, I myself, Meno, am as poor as my fellow citizens in this matter, and I blame myself for my complete ignorance about virtue. So, right off, Socrates is kind of saying, look, there's nothing wrong with acknowledging you don't know. But Meno has to be brought to that point because he's very knowledgeable, at least in his own mind.
yeah.
So,
I'll just pick up.
yes,
Oh, sorry,
keep
Courtney,
going.
you've asked some questions here in the chat.
Oh, no rush to get into them. It's just, yeah, it's good to keep things moving along, isn't it? So, yeah, what's the setup? As you said, Meno kind of starts pretending to know or thinking he knows. Socrates claims he doesn't know, and then he asks Meno, right? Like, well, give us an example. What's virtue? And he tries to pressure Meno into giving some sort of answer. That's what's going on in the beginning, isn't it? And then Meno's kind of out of his depths very quickly already.
Yeah, but also take a note of this paragraph when he launches into what he's obviously told large groups of people in his public speaking career already. He says, "It's not hard to tell you, Socrates. First, if you want the virtue of a man, it is easy to say that a man's virtue consists in being able to manage public affairs, and in so doing to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, and to be careful that no harm comes to himself. If you want the virtue of a woman, it is not difficult to describe. She must manage the home well, preserve its possessions, and be submissive to her husband. The virtue of a child, whether male or female, is different again, and so is that of an elderly man. If you want that, or if you want that of a free man or a slave. And there are very many other virtues, so that one is not at a loss to say what virtue is." So this is Plato's totally sending up the idea that there's different virtues for all these different kinds of people. There's actually only virtues and only virtue, as we know. And of course, that's something that the Stoics picked up big time. So eventually, Musonius Rufus, for example, will underscore that no, there's not two different kinds of virtue for men and women. It's exactly the same because men and women are the same as regards their rationality and their capacity. But here, Meno very confidently is asserting something quite different.
And it raises an interesting thing straight off the bat. I think you just triggered me to think of it because the Stoics obviously have to approach this issue too, is that have Socrates is interested in the general categories, and he like what is virtue itself? And he says in the next bit, for example, I seem to be in great luck, Meno. He's being a bit sarcastic here. While I'm looking for one virtue, I have found you to have a whole swarm of them. And this becomes the problem with Meno's exposition on virtue is he can't say what virtue is. He can only give examples of parts of virtue or examples of specific types of virtues. And that's an interesting issue that you could table, and that is if the Stoics don't really have, maybe say something, what's the word? I mean, this is debatable, but a kind of general category of things, like a form of things, but rather specific instances of the thing, then how do they get around that particular issue? Obviously, it's a bit different from what Socrates is going to go out of his way to prove. But that's an interesting problem in itself. Do you know what I mean? Or am I wording that in a really clunky way?
Do the Stoics have a definition for virtue?
Yeah, I think they treat it as a knowledge, which is interesting, right? Because that's debatable whether it's a knowledge or not a knowledge in this text.
All right.
So we're sort of getting ahead there, but that's something to consider. Why the Stoics so very interested in making sure it is classed as a knowledge, whereas for Socrates, he's really uncertain, at least here. I think in different texts, right, Judith, he kind of takes different positions, though.
Yeah, I don't think he would object to the idea that it's a knowledge. It's just he's probably not ever that kind of specific about it. But also with regard to the Stoic point of view, yes, virtues are knowledges, they're forms of cognition, but in saying that, they're also they're a mind in a certain disposition. So, and when I say a mind, I mean something that's actually not any different from a body, because there's only bodies in Stoicism. So it's a person's being that is disposed in a certain way, which is kind of very awkward to say in English, but yeah, it's a knowledge, but it's also a disposition, I would say.
And then that seems to be something a little bit different from what Socrates is getting at, or is it? That's an interesting issue. I think because as I understand the Stoics, they don't have the same, what's the word, metaphysical orientation, I guess, that Plato's coming from, that there is a immortal soul that has access to forms that are the archetypes behind the things, the specific concrete instances of things. The Stoics aren't looking at the world quite that way. Probably they see the whole world as something like a creative fire, a bit like a plastic kind of material that is one thing but changes shape and becomes other things, or something like that. Do you see it differently, Judith?
No, I think that's a good characterization. And I think you're right to bring that up at this point, because here in this metaphor or this example about the bees, this is kind of really getting to that issue, I think, that you brought up, Courtney, because Socrates is trying to pin down what's their beingness, what is their being as bees that you can really put your finger on, and of course, Meno doesn't really have any idea. And also, and I suppose this also shades into what would become a big issue, particularly for, say, Aristotle, and also every Greek philosopher after Aristotle, is kinds, is categories. Essentially what distinguishes this thing from that thing. So yeah, I think this is a key kind of precursor to those questions and debates.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to consider it here, because also thinking about how, the kind of work that Plato's setting up here, Socrates is going to go for his solution as being in recollection, that the soul already knew this before birth, whereas the Stoics can't do that, so they have to answer a similar problem in a very different way.
What are the possibilities between knowledge and virtue?
That it is a knowledge, and that
Yeah.
and critically in here, if it's a knowledge, it can be taught, and there are people teaching it, and there are people learning it.
If it's a knowledge, it's necessarily virtue. And if it's a virtue, it's necessarily knowledge. Are they synonymous?
No, well, not precisely coextensive. I think if it's a virtue, it's a knowledge, but not all knowledges are virtues. So some knowledges are techni, so particular crafts, forms of expertise. So you know what a doctor has or what a lawyer has,
Okay.
they're forms of expertise, but they're not necessarily virtues, although they could be exercised in a virtuous way.
Okay. So, but virtue is necessarily knowledge. There's no virtue that's not knowledge.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, that's the debate that goes on in here.
Hmm.
I don't want to jump ahead, but it all hinges on that it can be taught. And if no one's teaching it, can it be taught?
I do think this introduction is quite interesting as well, this first part, because it makes an assumption that we do know some of these definitions, and I think it highlights the importance. And Socrates gets into it here around, well, hang on, tell me what you actually mean, because it's like, well, let's talk about virtue, and we assume that we know what virtue is, and then we start giving some examples, and then further on in the discussion, the examples begin to change. And at the start of 72, there's this section here where we say, you're getting into some of the role characteristics. We say there's a virtue for every action and every age, for every task. And you listen to that and you think, that actually sounds pretty good. But we could make the mistake then around not actually pressing that any further to find out what an actual definition is, because at this stage we're still just giving examples. And then Socrates comes in and says, great, well, what does it actually mean? And then we come into the idea of, well, what's a shape, what's a color? And then we run into, you know, your squares, your triangles, purple and blue. So I just thought that was a good part of that initial thing around, well, let's try and define things and just be aware when we are talking around just the difference between giving examples to clarify a point and then what the definition is.
But it,
Well, I just
but it
think,
seems to me, sorry, but it seems to me that this is one dialogue where it specifically does not define virtue. Am I wrong?
Yeah. Doesn't.
I
no,
think you're right,
Doesn't.
Jody.
yeah.
That's one of the respects in which the dialogue finishes in aporia, in it's a dead end.
Yeah.
Because
Well, it's
yeah,
not exactly, because I hate to be, you know, what do you call it when you give the ending away? But you know,
spoiler
the
alert.
spoiler alert. He actually does say it's a gift from God, right? That's his last statement and the whole thing. He says, "Oh well,
Yeah,
it's a gift from God," you know. So that was interesting as well.
yeah.
Oh, well, that's it. It's all over now. Might as well pack up. Well, I read it as him saying, you know, it could be this or it could be that. You know, there's
Hmm.
questions either way. But I think he's genius in this setup though, you know, wouldn't you guys agree? Like Meno is saying something that's easy to say. He's just, you know, Socrates right now in the next page pins him down and he says, okay, right, tell us then, what do you think virtue is? And when pressed, he says the same thing he got from Gorgias, that it is the being able to rule over people. And then Socrates pushes him a bit further and says, well, wouldn't you say justly and not justly? Because he's obviously repeating something here, this ruling over people that's kind of taken as sensible or kind of, you know, I guess a well-worn kind of sophistical account of what virtue might be. But then he says, so is it, you know, wouldn't you say justly or not justly? And then I'm looking at top of page 187, 874, sorry. And he says, is it virtue, Meno, or a virtue? And it gets into the same problem again. And he finds that when he says justice, that he's referring to a part of virtue again. And so Socrates feigns this kind of indignation. You're doing it again. You're just picking on parts. Why can't you just tell me what it is? I don't see what the problem is. And that's where it's clever, Travis, because what he's doing is saying, you know, if I was talking about squares or hexagons or straight things, you know, I'm really talking about shapes. And I know you could tell me what a square or a triangle is, and we could talk about what a shape is. And that's the next section, in fact, where he kind of takes up the challenge to show what's his name? Meno, that if he wanted to, he could describe what a shape is. And he knows that shapes are kind of the more general category of triangles, squares, straight things, hexagons. But he can't get Meno to say, he's trying to get Meno to take up the same challenge by thinking about virtue in the same way. And Meno's sort of stuck because he can't think of in what way virtue could be like the category shape that contains all these parts that he keeps talking about. It's very clever. It's very well done.
So he's trying to get them to define the generality rather than the instances.
Yeah, and Meno can only account for instances, and when pressed, he falls into this circular kind of loop where he just keeps talking about virtues in reference to other virtues, in reference to other virtues, but he can't say anything about virtue.
Well, what I find interesting within all these, talking about virtue, we're saying about the man and the woman and all that, these are particular activities, but surely any activity would be dependent on intention as to whether it would be virtue. Surely just the mere activity wouldn't define virtue. It would have to be the intention in relation. So something that may consider to be non-virtuous, but due to an intention would define that being virtuous.
Yeah, maybe, but Socrates is all about defining a thing before they go out and investigate it. So before they start looking at intentions and behaviors and specific examples, he wants to know what it is that they're actually discussing, and they're already stuck.
But can't you define virtue as intention? Healthy intention or intention that brings about, well-being or a good result.
Well, from the Greek, Judith, it's arete, isn't it?
Yeah, so it means excellence, literally. Arete, it means excellence, or yeah, so the perfected form of something. Intention is great, but I don't think intention guarantees or can guarantee virtue. For example, in the New Southern Star Stoics, we've been examining the four cardinal virtues in some detail, and take for example courage, right? So you think, oh well, it's easy to kind of think of an example of courage, but it's very difficult to say what it actually is, and intention is part of it, but intention doesn't guarantee that an act or a person is courageous or wise or just or self-controlled. So yes, I think intention is a necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient to achieve virtuous action or state.
So one would have to have a healthy intention for it to be a virtue, surely.
Yes, it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition, I think. Yeah.
So there has to be something more than a healthy intention, you're saying.
Yeah, I think so. For example, here's something that's come up in the study we've done on courage. It's in Plato's dialogue on the Laches, called the Laches. Say you've got someone who seems brave in a sense because they're just standing there in a battle and they're persisting, but and their intention may be sound, but maybe the whole project, the whole action, the whole campaign might be misguided. And that might have an impact on whether their particular contribution to it was virtuous or not. It may or it may not, it's kind of dependent on the actual situation. So, and it's maybe even more visible in, I suppose, in the virtue of justice. Certainly there's cases where people think that they're acting justly and certainly have the intention to act justly, but actually bring about a situation which results in injustice. So I think, as I say, intention is a baseline, but it certainly doesn't get you all the way there.
So would killing an enemy be considered virtue?
Well, again, it depends. Socrates himself was a very brave soldier in Athens campaigns,
Mm.
but killing an enemy, in a sense, it's doing your job if you're a soldier and that's your responsibility. So that's, potentially virtuous or sort of some way to it.
Right.
But again, it also depends on whether you actually know what you're doing or not. If you're doing it in an unreflective and perhaps impulsive way, then that's probably not going to be virtuous.
Mm.
Catherine's here.
Catherine.
Hi.
Hello, I'm here. I just wanted to follow on from that, Judy, and just say that both sides, like depending on the perspective, could think that they were being just, but depending on what perspective and value judgment you put on, like, yeah, it just really changes. It's the judgment, I feel. Like, I think it's judgment and belief that gets people into a lot of trouble. So, two parties could be fighting and doing terrible things and still seeing themselves as virtuous in the same situation, even though they're opposing forces. And that's just conflict, isn't it? And it just like, where's the right and wrong in that?
And that probably fits with this argument, right? Because you guys are talking about instances of supposed virtue, and so Socrates wants to get to a definition of what virtue is. So like the square and the triangle and the oval, he's saying, well, they might be instances. So what is it that is the general thing that explains all those things? And he's talking about shape, and then he talks about color follows shape, and color also is one of those things that contains instances of types of color. So we all know that black, red, and green and orange and whatever are all color. So what is it about them that makes them fit into the same thing, the same family, the same general thing? And that's where we can look at how he gets there, because it's kind of important for the argument. On the next page, he says, Meno pins him down. Well, asks him. It's a bit tongue in cheek. He sort of says, "Well, you tell me what a shape is, then. Show me how to do it." And Socrates is funny as usual and goes on about like, "Oh, you're a cheeky sod, aren't you? You're so spoilt, telling me what to do like I'm your lover or something." And then he says about, yeah, there, see how you got the section there? He says, shape always follows color. This is Meno. Well, then if someone were to say that he did not know what color is, but that he had the same difficulty as he had about shape, what do you think the answer would be? So this is Socrates. And what Socrates does here is actually really clever, because it's actually hard to try and answer a question like this. What is shape? And he says, okay, if my questioner was one of those clever and disputatious debaters, I would say to him, I have given my answer. If it is wrong, it is your job to refute it. Then if they are friends, as you are and I are, and want to discuss with each other, they must answer in a manner more gentle and more proper to discussion. So introduce this question and answer style. By this I mean that the answers must not only be true, but in terms admittedly known to the questioner. So there's a method behind this as well. I too will try to speak in these terms. So he's going to put out some terms and ask Meno if he can agree to the terms to ensure that they're talking about the same sorts of things in the first place, as to elicit a definition that they can both be happy with. And he says, do you call something the end? So he's just checking that he's not going to get stuck into this endless debate around terms. And we can assume that Meno agrees that he knows what the end signifies. And then Socrates clarifies it by saying, I mean such a thing as a limit or a boundary. For all those are, I say, the same thing. Prodicus might disagree with us, but you surely call something finished or completed. That is what I want to express, nothing elaborate. So he's really pinning him down to get him to agree to some basic terms. So this is sort of displaying his method. And so Meno goes, I do, and I think I understand what you mean. We can imagine, I guess, the sophists being very slippery with their definitions, using one definition here and then changing it up somewhere else, or using definitions that part of the common vernacular, but no one's ever sat down to properly define them. And so that's what makes the dialectical approach clever, is that he starts out making sure that everyone's talking about the same thing with specific terms. So then he says, so you call something a plane and something else a solid, as in geometry. And Meno says, I do. And Socrates, from this you may understand what I mean by shape. For I say this of every shape, that a shape is that which limits a solid. In a word, a shape is the limit of a solid. It's really clever, I think. And then he says, would he say color is Socrates? That's on the next page. And he says, you're outrageous, Meno. You bother an old man to answer questions, but you yourself are not willing to recall and to tell me what Gorgias says that virtue is. It's being cheeky again. And then Meno says, well, once you tell me, I'll tell you. And it's funny because Socrates has this banter. Even someone who is blindfolded would know from your conversation that you are handsome and still have lovers. And I mean, is this just tongue in cheek or is there something more going on? It's curious. This is some sort of cultural artifact, Judith, this kind of flirting between men in Greek culture or something. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it is, but it's also Socrates demonstrating that he absolutely has Meno's number, that he's this, he's good looking, he's well connected, he's rich, he's powerful in his little provincial place up in Thessaly. So, he's showing that he knows exactly how kind of self-important Meno is in a sense, but also, and he's doing it in a fun way, right? He's not doing it in a nasty way. He's doing it in a fun way, and in a kind of a flattering way. That Meno is young, good looking, and knows everybody, and is rich, and has every possible advantage in life. Except now it turns out he's actually reasonably clueless. But it's fun, and it's
And Meno's good-natured, right? As
yeah,
opposed
that's
to...
right. He is. He means well.
Yes.
He's not. He really is trying to now that he's been kind of taken down a peg or two. He's been set on his heels a little bit in the foregoing, but he really wants to learn, I think. So yeah, he comes across as a serious and an honest interlocutor,
And I
which
think...
is not the case with every time that in these dialogues.
Well, I was going to say that occasionally Plato sets up these sort of interlocutors that take various positions regarding their allegiance to collaboratively finding the truth. I think we found it in Philebus, if I recall. But there's usually somebody who's admits that they're wrong or willing to have the discussion in good faith. And I think that's kind of the position that Socrates is kind of very fond of. He wants people to admit that we don't actually know and kind of give up the pretense of knowing, and then you can get on with the business of sort of working it out and trying to figure out a way towards knowledge at the very least. But then you always get these characters who come along and they get angry with Socrates because they're not acting in good faith. They're only there to protect not knowledge, but the customs of the time and place, for example, or their own reputation or whatever. But this next exchange is quite interesting, right? Because he gives you a bit of an idea of the psychology of the time, perhaps, and it comes from Empedocles. So in trying to answer what color is, he talks about effluvia. I had to go and look up the word effluvia. Apparently, it's like invisible emanations, right? So things are emitting these invisible emanations, and basically, it's quite interesting. These emanations reach the eye, and the eye is fitted to these emanations in such a way that color happens, or color is the effluvia and whatever. It's a kind of theory of sight, isn't it? And how the senses work. Because then he generalizes this to how the senses, like smell and hearing, work as well with other kind of
Yeah.
things. That's very
Which is really
interesting.
interesting. As you say, Courtney, it's really interesting because and we might be tempted to kind of say, oh, well, we obviously know that there's no effluvia, but this idea sort of worked its way through the Epicureans. They also believed in effluvia. And when you think about it, vision is something that really, until probably the 19th or even the 20th century, was not really understood. It was a big deal, particularly in the 17th century, and developments in the study of vision were absolutely key to kind of scientific knowledge. But really, people, as I say, it was not until very recent times that we really had some better ideas around vision. And and when you and they're kind of very counterintuitive notions that we nowadays have about vision, which is to do with, inverted images and light hitting the back of our eyes or whatever. So yeah, it's all very counterintuitive. So we shouldn't be kind of dismissive about these theories that were circulating um, when they were trying to understand what was actually involved with sense impressions.
Yeah, and actually, that's a bit, in a sense, a kind of critique of science. I know science is objectively correct and it can do things with that sort of knowledge. But on the other hand, it's more in line with the phenomenological experience of having sensory impressions is a kind of matching between you and the thing that you're looking at. So on the one hand, you might have a view, and I think this was kind of a view back then, that sight reaches out a little bit like little hands and kind of investigates objects, and somehow the object is reaching back, like in this case through effluvia or whatever, and that these two activities are matched together in some way. And it makes sense from a, say, modern systems approach, that these two systems come together and they harmonize in such a way that information can be passed between them. So it's actually not as crazy as it sounds. It actually sounds, when you put it like that and think about other different kinds of disciplines like ecological psychology and things like that, they do talk in a very similar fashion. It might not exactly explain the physiology of sight, but it definitely says more about the experience of sight in a certain way. And the same can be said, I guess, about the, what do you call it, heliocentric kind of universe versus the one in which the Earth is the center. Because from a phenomenological point of view, we feel like the Earth is the center of the cosmos because we're standing on it and we live here and we experience our lives from this perspective. The other one is actually rather abstract, even though it's scientifically accurate. So, yeah, I just find all that stuff interesting. That's me kind of geeking out a bit there. But, yeah, pardon me.
The exchange too, I think, is interesting, and what I've got written down is in my notes is to beware sometimes technical nonsense. Not in this particular exchange, because we've started out saying, well, what exactly is virtue? So we're trying to get to a definition from multiple examples. But I think there's this nice tongue-in-cheek moment with explaining what color is and shapes is, where Socrates then says, it's this theatrical answer, so it's pleasing to us. Because if we have to come up with our own definition on what a shape or a color is, it'd be quite difficult on the spot to come up with that. Like for me, a shape is probably when all the points enclose themselves. And you might have a different example of that. But if we're engaged in a talk day to day, we know enough around what a shape is to continue a conversation. So I thought that was quite interesting around at what point do you need to stop with the very technical definition and just continue looking at the examples and trying to group them into different classifications or categories, which they do get to later on. We have a new definition that comes up.
But I think that's what's so genius about Socrates' method, because he knows somehow, he's such a genius, he's able to go, look, it's pointless talking about triangles and squares and things. if we want to know what they are, you know. And I think you just said, Travis, quite clearly, like they can be connected by their points or whatever. That's basically what he's saying. He's saying it's the limit of a solid. So I think he's right. And it might seem kind of gratuitous, but it's actually extremely practical for getting past this roadblock that the sophists are obviously very good at doing. That they have these very persuasive arguments that Socrates is clearly suspicious about because they say a lot of words and they convince people and they charge lots of money. And maybe part of the reason that they're so convincing is because they're well connected and good looking and all the reasons that, you know, you mentioned, Judith. But in fact, you know, it doesn't get you anywhere. They can't even define the most basic thing about the topic they're talking about. And then this is an interesting bit in the next section. I was curious about what you thought, Judith, because right here he says, right after that bit about the theatrical answer, he says, "It is not better, son of Alexidemus, but I am convinced that the other is, and I think that you would agree, if you did not have to go away before the mysteries, as you told me yesterday, but could remain and be initiated." So they have this little talk about the Eleusinian mysteries, and
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah,
appears
see,
out
that
of
was what,
nowhere.
yeah, 100%. And that was one thing that struck me this time, which all my previous readings of this dialogue, I'd never noticed that. But yeah, this is an instance where Socrates shows, just these three little lines. He's showing he was tuned into where Meno must have said, "Oh, look, I can't stay around very long. I've got to go home, back, whatever." Okay. But if he'd stayed in Athens, he would have been, or could have been, initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, which is, of course, a very life-changing event. But for some reason, Meno's decided that's not for him. He's got other priorities. And so, in a sense, yeah, it's just a reference to, look, you've already said you're not ready to commit to that particular important life event. So, yeah, it's kind of Socrates um, showing that he understands, in a sense, Meno's maybe his fundamental lack of seriousness. Maybe that's kind of what he's gesturing to there.
Well, I'd say I was going to make a joke and say that Meno is anti-drugs, but but more likely the topic of this whole thing eventually becomes pretty much the topic of mystery religion stuff. It's like the immortality of the soul and recollection and so on. It's the topic of what you'd expect them to be thinking or talking about if they were being initiated in some sort of mystery cult. And apparently Meno doesn't have time for that, or he hasn't been initiated. And if then uninitiated, by definition, it means, in a sense, that he hasn't been let into the secrets of the mysteries. He doesn't know this stuff. He will forever be ignorant unless he gets initiated by through the process, so to speak. So I think
Yeah.
that's important.
It is important, and we kind of skimmed over it at the very beginning, but the very first few paragraphs of the dialogue, Socrates shows that he knows everything about Meno. He knows his family, he knows his connections, he knows his close relationship with, I've forgotten the guy's name, but he's described as his lover. Socrates knows everything about Meno, and so yeah, he's approaching it in a serious and committed way, but it doesn't seem as though Meno really is.
There's a really interesting section that comes up on the next page, but I feel like I'm hogging it. You guys jump in. It's about desiring beautiful things, doing the right thing, desiring bad things or good things. Seems to me pretty relevant.
Yeah, exactly. Because this, again, and this comes up in so many other dialogues. Just as when we mentioned, you mentioned, Courtney, about this idea of limit, this is how we define a shape. It's to do with a limit. That came up in the syllabus, didn't it? It was, the limits on things. But yeah, here, exactly, this is something that would come up later in the Gorgias and the Protagoras. Do people desire bad things? Well, not exactly, no. They desire things that they imagine will be good, but are not actually good. And that's that's one of the ways in which they go astray.
It's kind of reminiscent of the Euthydemus, just that section. I can read it if you want. He says, there are some who believe that the bad things benefit them, others who know that the bad things harm them. And Socrates says, and do you think that those who believe that bad things benefit them know that they are bad? No, that I cannot altogether believe. And then Socrates says, it is clear then that those who do not know things to be bad do not desire what is bad, but they desire those things that they believe to be good, but that are in fact bad. It follows that those who have no knowledge of these things and believe them to be good clearly desire good things. Is that not so? It is likely. Very similar to what we get in Euthydemus. And then he says, well then, those who you say desire bad things, believing that bad things harm their possessor, know that they will be harmed by them necessarily, says Meno. And then Socrates, and do they not think that those who are harmed are miserable to the extent that they are harmed? That too is inevitable. And that those who are miserable are unhappy? I think so. Does anyone wish to be miserable and unhappy? I do not think so, Socrates. No one then wants what is bad, unless he wants to be such. For what else is being miserable but to desire bad things and to secure them? So it's very interesting. I love that sort of way that Socrates does his ethical work, and he always boils it down to this problem of the only bad thing is ignorance, the only good thing is wisdom, and everything else in between is indifferent. And I think this is just another example of that working out.
So is it ignorance that is sort of inhibiting the connection with that recollection, which they're considering to be the basis for virtue?
Yeah.
Obscuring it?
Yeah. And in this case, we're all ignorant, until we can discover through maybe recollection. And the thing is, you know what I like about it? Because I've thought about this just in work, for example. I think, and he's going to say this pretty much specifically, why this idea of people aren't bad and people don't desire bad things, but people would prefer to want good things if only they knew what the good things were. And in fact, they only choose the bad things because they mistakenly think of the bad things as good things. Why this really makes sense as a practical way of thinking about change or knowledge, for example, is it's motivational. It does away with the idea that people are inherently bad and they can't be changed. So the beautiful thing about such an approach, and this was one of the questions I put in the chat, is I don't think Socrates is necessarily saying, I really believe this. He's doing what he does when he talks about right opinion. He's saying, I could completely be wrong, but it might lead to the right outcome. And the right outcome is that it spurs people on towards a pursuit for the truth, the beautiful and the good, even if it's just, like a nice story. But what it does is it provides a kind of motivational impetus. It instead of giving up or feeling that I lack what was born into me or whatever, it can be, one can make progress towards it. And I think that's what's really important about this idea of recollection. And that's why I asked the question, how do the Stoics take the same sort of motivational approach, and they do it in a different way. But I think they've got the same agenda in mind. It's pointless to tell people if they're not born with it, they can't, they're fucked, you know. They have to think that they can find a cure to their ignorance somehow and be motivated to pursue it with all their might, kind of thing, because it's the most important thing to live well and to be good and to be happy.
So is Socrates' position that actually that you cannot be taught virtue? Because I would have thought you can be taught virtue so that you can overcome the ignorance to connect with the recollection.
Yeah, we're getting to that bit.
Okay.
So I think this was interesting in this next section, where again Socrates is kind of pressing on this issue to do with the fact that Meno is this fabulously wealthy and well-connected person. He's the guest friend of the great king. You know, he's a family friend of the king of Persia, which is just like saying you're a family friend of Elon Musk or whatever. It's that kind of a status. That's what Meno is. You know, he's not just anyone. That's in sort of worldly terms. He is about as important and well connected as anyone can possibly be. And so that's what Socrates says very well. According to Meno, the hereditary guest friend of the great king, virtue is the acquisition of gold and silver. It's obviously he's being satirical. Do you add to this acquiring Meno the words justly and piously, or does it make no difference to you? But even if one secures these things unjustly, you call it virtue nonetheless? And even Meno kind of feels that sting a bit. He says, certainly not, Socrates. So, and this is where Socrates brings in this idea that, okay, well, if we are to do something justly, acquiring anything justly, then it has to be to do with, accompanied by justice or moderation or piety or some other part of virtue. You know, you can't just go around collecting gold and think of that as virtue. That's obviously not. It has to be done in a right way. If it is not, it will not be virtue, even though it provides good things. But Meno's still a bit clueless. He says, how could there be virtue without these? Then failing to secure gold and silver, whenever it would not be just to do so, either for oneself or another, is not this failure to secure them also virtue? And so Meno's kind of saying, well, yeah, so it seems.
And Socrates says,
So apparently
gotcha!
that's right. Whatever is done with justice will be virtue, and what is done without anything of the kind is wickedness. I think it must necessarily be as you say. So I think we've, I think Socrates has made a kind of a big step here. He's trying to get Meno to change his worldview.
No, but he does it again. He's doing exactly the same thing over again. Because right in the next line, he says, "You're playing with me, Meno." How so, Socrates? Because I just asked you not to fragment up virtue and you're doing it again. Basically. Poor old Meno must be feeling rather ridiculous because he's basically just fell into the same mistake over again, walked straight into it. And to kind of press him here on the next page, 879, halfway down, 80, yeah, there you go. He says, answer me again then from the beginning, because he's had enough of this compartmentalizing virtue or breaking it up into fragments. What do you and your friends say that virtue is? You know, he's asked this quite a few times. And Meno's been saying he can tell him. Socrates, before I even met you, I used to hear that you were always in a state of perplexity and that you bring others to the same state. And now I think you are bewitching and beguiling me. So funny. Simply putting me under a spell so that I am quite perplexed. Indeed, if a joke is in order, you seem in appearance and in every other way to be like the broad torpedo fish, which is like an electric eel or something, like a stingray. For it too makes anyone who comes close and touches it feel numb. blah, blah, blah. And then he says, yet I have many speeches about virtue before large audience on 1,000 occasions. Very good speeches, as I thought. But now I cannot even say what it is. I think you are wise not to sail away from Athens to go and stay elsewhere. For if you were to behave like this as a stranger in another city, you would be driven away for practicing sorcery. And all he's doing is asking him to define his terms. And I wonder if that's if there's any. I think that's an interesting point. You better not leave Athens. You could be considered a sorcerer because we know how things turn out for him in Athens. Basically, it's a bit like saying the people are so superstitious that they're going to burn him at the stake. And kind of that's what happens. They charge him with introducing new gods and what is it? Misleading the youth of the city or whatever. So I think that's really interesting. And it also tells us something about the nature of argument in this time, presumably. And I think the argument occurs, well, not the argument, this kind of commentary happens in Martha Nussbaum's book, if you remember. She talks about logos and logoi being the kind of arguments that have causative power. They could be arguments, they could be spells, they could be prayers, but they can actually excite something in the person. They can actually get inside them and cause a change of character. So here we have a clue that philosophy done well can actually alter a person's character, or arguments done badly could poison a person's character. There's also that element to this as well. So there's a serious tone to all this. It's kind of playing on a few different levels.
Yeah, that's right. I totally agree, Courtney. It's active on different levels. And he says, and Meno says here, you have seemed to have had that kind of effect on me, for both my mind and my tongue are numb, and I've no ends to give you. So this is Meno, who remember he started the dialogue with these questions of Socrates, and he's the one who's been giving these speeches about virtue, and now he's literally kind of struck dumb because he realizes he really doesn't know anything. And that's a kind of a very humbling experience. I think what he's expressing here is something that a lot of us might have felt when we came across a problem that we really didn't have anything to, our thoughts are in such confusion that we can't really contribute anything in the moment. And that's what he's kind of trying to say. And also, you're right, Courtney, to point to this idea about, I think you're wise not to sail away from Athens. Because later in the dialogue, Anytus comes in and he says,
Yeah.
I think you better not go around in Athens saying those kind of things. So essentially, Socrates is being told, oh, don't say that kind of stuff in Athens, and also don't say that kind of stuff anywhere else. So yeah, it's funny.
But also in that next paragraph where Socrates, I know why you drew this image of me. Why do you think I did? So that I should draw an image of you in return. And he then goes on to do his typical thing about I know nothing, It's an interesting paragraph.
It's interesting going back to what you're saying there about saying certain things. Part of this is about, the danger of speaking the truth, the danger of trying to get people to think. It sounds like a harmless activity. And it's interesting because there are people who are professional speakers in this story who who can go around and get paid lots of money to give speeches or to teach people how to argue. But when a person does it in a way that's unpopular and challenges the status quo, oh, you better watch out, that's not cool. That could cost you your head. And I wonder, we still think like that today in certain cultures. We're probably lucky to live in Australia, but in a lot of countries of the world, that's a live issue, isn't it? That it is dangerous to speak back to power speak back to the status quo.
And that's what, yeah, this is what this final sentence on this page, page 879, where Socrates says, "So now I do not know what virtue is. Perhaps you knew before you contacted me, but now you are certainly like one who does not know. Nevertheless, I want to examine and seek together with you what it may be." So that's the dialectical process. Now they're both going to pursue what they can find out about it. So it's a kind of a reset. It's yeah, we're now on the same page. And now that Meno's been kind of reduced to this numbness, then they can proceed on a kind of an honest basis. Because again, this idea that, well, actually to be confused is much better than to be going down the wrong track.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And from that medical analogy, right? It's almost like being anesthetized. You're kind of struck dumb. But I'm also thinking from the point of view of initiation, what you get is you're usually stupefied with drugs or something like that, and your normal mindset leaves you so that you can't, your ego is not in the way. And it's a similar process. He's struck him dumb with his exotic drugs, his pharmacos, you know. And also, it makes me realize, you know, I've been thinking about this a little bit, that there's a kind of preparatory work that has to be done before you can make the person ripe for actually doing the kind of work where they can truly examine themselves. So you can't just jump straight into it. There's a procedure that has to come first in order to prepare the person for the kind of experience that's going to change them, that's going to reveal something, that's going to be transformative in some way.
And actually, right here at the top of the page, Meno comes up with this, what's come to be known as the Meno problem. And it shows that he's actually thinking, because he says, "How will you look for it, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something when you do not know at all? If you should meet with it, how will you know that this is a thing that you did not know?" So that's actually really a good, really perceptive kind of question from Meno, because Socrates has said, well, we're going to set out to find out what virtue is, but Meno's made the point, well, hang on, if we really don't even know what it is, how are we going to recognize it when we come across it? And that's a really insightful point.
But again, that's exactly why I think Socrates comes up with his way out, the motivational thing, because if you don't, you're liable to fall into this problem. How can I find out? Because on the one hand, how can you search for what you don't know? And on the other, if you know it, there's no need to search for it, nor for what he does not know, for he does not know what to look for. And so this is precisely why Socrates has to defeat this problem, and he defeats the problem through the open door that recollection kind of represents.
But in the meantime, he goes back to this idea of the divine and what the priests and the priestesses do. And that's the kind of the detour that he seems to take here.
Detour?
He said,
It's not a detour.
well, yeah, it's an apparent detour, but turns out not to be a detour. But yeah, he says, "I've heard wise men and women talk about divine matters. What did they say? What was I thought both true and beautiful? What was it, and who were they? The speakers were among the priests and priestesses whose care it is to be able to give an account of their practices." And so not only does kind of Socrates here resort to the divine, but he resorts to the poets. Now, you know, if a lot of people have this idea that Socrates and Plato were very much against the poets, well, not really. And if you actually look at what he says, he appreciates the wisdom that the poets express. And here it's the wisdom of Pindar, many others of the divine among our poets. And so he quotes this very evocative passage from Pindar. But and as the kind of the background to this doctrine that the human soul is immortal. At times it comes to an end, which they call dying. At times it is reborn, but it is never destroyed, and one must therefore live one's life as piously as possible. Persephone will return to the sun above in the 9th year, the souls of those from whom she will exact punishment for old miseries. And from these come noble kings, mighty in strength and greatest in wisdom, and for the rest of the time men will call them sacred heroes. So there's a lot going on with that quote from Pindar, but relevantly here, it's about one reason for living as virtuously as one can, or pursuing virtue as much as one can, is because our being will persist through different lifetimes in this worldview.
So I know you don't mean detour literally, but I think this is my hunch is that everything that came before was the preparation for this, because what happens now is Meno is softened up, his ego is relaxed, and then he opens the door to the initiation, the mysteries. And this is the topic that would be proper to an initiatory kind of cult, hence the poets and the mythology and all the rest of it, and the topic. And so it's a movement from the world of political affairs to something completely different, isn't it? It's care for the soul now, which is the proper topic of philosophy, and it can only be gotten there through a kind of preparation, a kind of purification. So Socrates has purified his opponent somehow through his use of dialectic thus far. And this bit's brilliant. Do you want to read the next section? I think it's a beautiful section.
As the soul is immortal, has been born often, and has seen all things here and in the underworld, there is nothing which it has not learned. So it is in no way surprising that it can recollect the things it knew before, both about virtue and other things. As the whole of nature is akin, and the soul has learned everything, nothing prevents a man, after recalling one thing only, a process men call learning, discovering everything else for himself, if he is brave and does not tire of the search. For searching and learning are as a whole recollection. We must therefore not believe that debater's argument, for it would make us idle and faint-hearted men to like to hear it, whereas my argument makes them energetic and keen on the search. I trust that this is true, and I want to inquire along with you into the nature of virtue. Isn't that beautiful? It's just brilliant.
But exactly right. He's saying we can't believe what the debaters said previously with that paradox. This argument opens the way for the energetic spirit that will keep going, be desperately keen on the search for the truth. Whereas if you believe the other one, which a lot of people like because they're lazy and they lack courage, this argument is the motivation that spurs you on, keeps you going. And I think the Stoics have their own version of it because they make theirs a germinating seed that the Logos implants in the soul of the person, and that when you exercise, it grows and flourishes. So they're doing the same thing, but using a different model.
It might be a good point to kind of, I mean, some of us have been familiar with these ideas for some time. If this is your first time reading Meno, how do you respond, or how do you react to this idea that learning is recollection, or I mean, we're going to get more into it, I suppose, with the demonstration, but what's your initial response?
You've heard what I think. I think literally it's just a story, but what he's trying to achieve is amazing, awesome. I mean, Socrates' role is to convince us that there's nothing more important in life than to find the truth. And if you listen to these old crotchety old men or whatever with their debaters' arguments, you'll just give up. You'll fall into a hole and you'll just go along with the status quo. But if you believe something like this, some kind of story or it doesn't even matter what the content of the story is, so long as it provides this kind of um, metaphysical conception of the self that would always naturally gravitate towards what is good and true and would cause you to do well and thrive if only you could remove the obstacles that were in the way, whether that be through recollection or whatever. It's beautiful, it's powerful. It's a much better model even in psychology today than the old pathological model that people have personality deficits that can't be changed or are resistant to change and so on and so forth. It's as relevant today as it was then.
I thought it was an interesting passage, and I just like the idea around the curiosity that it put in there. Like you have to go out and be adventurous to, remember or recollect everything. I thought that part there was really well said. I have, differing thoughts around the idea around the souls knowing everything and all of that, but from what's presented, yeah, I just like the argument that they're putting forward that we have to now be adventurous and curious, because we all have this divine soul within us. So it's kind of on us now to go and remember everything.
What do you think of it, Judith?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a very productive idea that and it encourages us to keep learning, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. It's incumbent on all of us because we have this ability to learn, keep learning as long as we can. So yeah, I think it's absolutely brilliant uh, and yeah, interestingly here, Meno's manner has kind of, he's been prepared, as you say, Courtney. He's been prepared for this initiation. He's humble now. He's the tone of his questions is completely different. He started the dialogue with this kind of aggressive, well, what is it, Socrates? But now he's kind of, yes, Socrates, but how do you mean that we do not learn, but that what we call learning is recollection? Can you teach me that this is so? He's so receptive now to the idea, and that's how we all need to be to learn.
Do you know why? Because he cares about the truth. He's willing to, it makes sense. It strikes him as the only way forward. There's no point in believing in something that hinders you. So in a way, I see it as a kind of maybe proto-pragmatism, like William James says, it's not about the truth. It's about the quality of life you would have if you took this idea to be true. How would that unfold into your life? What kind of life would you live? And I mean, I probably butchered that idea of pragmatism, but you get the idea what I mean, right? It's there are certain beliefs that you can hold that make you a good person, that can propel your life onward and make you relatively impervious to adversity because you see the good in everything as if it was given to you. And that's like what you see in this philosophy, you see it in the Stoic theory. But if you want to be like a hard-headed political realist and all that, how can you go out and do good works when you don't really believe in the good, or that your fellow people are capable of the good, or that your estimation of the good is actually extremely limited or confined to a certain sector of society, for example?
This next interchange is also illuminating, where Socrates, he's not going to kind of quite let Meno go yet. He says, no, as I just said now, Meno, you're a rascal. You now ask me if I can teach you when I say there is no teaching but recollection in order to show me up once as contradicting myself. And he knows that Meno didn't mean that, right? But he wants Meno to respond in a humble manner, which Meno then does. No, by you, Socrates, that was not my intention when I spoke, but just to have it. If you can somehow show me that things are as you say, please do so. So Meno is maximally receptive now to the process as it goes on.
And then they go into this long thing about squares. I mean, I get the point. Who can anyone run us through the squares? I just read it quickly and go, look, I'll take your word for it, Socrates.
Travis would know because he's very tech-minded. But I would also point out at this point, and this is what I meant to say earlier, but and Jody may also have a view on this as a maths teacher, but even today, right, we're very, as a culture, we're not very well informed about how people learn. There's an awful lot of theories, but ultimately, we're not 100% sure that we know how it is that people come to understand mathematical concepts. So yeah, just to say before we dismiss this idea of recollection out of hand, today we have a lot of theories, but again, we're not terribly sure how it is that people learn.
I can do a really quick little summary of roughly, if you wish, just the fact that he uses mainly the square that's 2 foot by 2 foot, which would be 4, and he doesn't say 4 square feet, he just says 4 feet. But he's meaning 2 feet by 2 feet is 4 square feet. And then he says, well, what would be a square? How could you get a square then that was 8 square feet? And he has to talk the lad through quite a process where they compare the outcome of if you doubled the side to 4 times 4, and then they come to the answer of 16, and they realise that that's not double. So then they go back to, well, what if I made it 3? And they come to 3 times 3 is 9, which is still not double. So it must be something less than 3 because they're trying to get to 8. So it must be something a little bit less than 3, they decide. So then they come up with this wonderful idea of let's cut each square in half, in then enabling the new square to be formed on the diagonals, which they discuss. And he helps the boy, well, the boy is then led really to surmise that what they have created is a square, which is indeed half of 16. Instead of 4 by 4 is 16, that he can see therefore that this square, which is created on the diagonals, is indeed 8. The side of the square, by the way, is 2 root 3, but anyway, let's not go there. Yeah, but anyway, yes. So I still felt in a way that he was leading the boy. That's my personal opinion. Inherent knowledge mathematically, if you want to read Bertrand Russell and people like that too, very intriguing on the basis of logic. And anyway, I won't go on, but that'll get us through to the end of that part.
I agree, Jody, about that, feeling like he was leading him on a bit towards the end. But there is a thing that was relevant in there. Do you know where he made the mistake at the beginning? He said, there's this and it's 2 foot, and there's the other thing and it's 2 foot, and whatever. The appearance, if you don't, if you just look at the appearance of it, or you just follow the previous example, you end up with a mistake. He ends up getting it wrong at the beginning. The slave boy says the wrong answer. And that's intentional for Socrates because he's showing that just like Meno or just like other people, you can get to a certain point and then appearances let you down. And you get stuck at that point and you sort
Yes,
of
so
make a
without the help
mistake.
of Socrates, so without the help of Socrates to take him back and rethink the process, it's very, people often in their ignorance will get stuck in their ignorance. They haven't got someone to take them back and relook at and see their error.
Just
That's the
like
thing.
the way that he helped Meno get unstuck.
Mm.
At that point when he felt numb, that was the bit when he became unstuck and he started to see more clearly and become a follower of Socrates and able to be led by him. And that's kind of what the slave boy's doing too. And when he was following the right procedure, even though he didn't have knowledge yet, he was able to have right opinion because he was following somebody who was a reliable guide. So there's another thing that's going on here then, and that is Socrates is making the account that um, discovering geometric or mathematical truths is somehow the same procedure that you could go about discovering ethical principles and truths, that there are same sort of thing in kind somehow. And that is questionable in itself, right? But that's the premise here.
Yeah,
I
and
al-
this is a great paragraph where he says, you realize, Meno, what point he has reached in his recollection. At first, he did not know what the basic line of the 8-foot square was. Even now, he does not yet know, but then he thought he knew and answered confidently as if he did know, and he did not think himself at a loss, but now he does think himself at a loss, and as he does not know, neither does he think he knows. That's true. So he is now in a better position with regard to the matter he does not know. I agree with that too. Have we done him any harm by making him perplexed and numb as the torpedo fish does? I do not think so. So that's important too, right? That even when you get confused and you realize you don't know, that's fine. You haven't been harmed. You're just learning. You're just in the process. You're just in one of the phases of the process. And Socrates adds, indeed, we have probably achieved something relevant to finding out how matters stand. For now, as he does not know, he would be glad to find out. Whereas before, and this is where he gets in another shot at Meno. Whereas before he thought he could easily make many fine speeches to large audiences about the square of double size and say that it must have a base twice as long. It's like, that was
But
pretty funny.
that's really important because again it highlights the point that I'm quite passionate about, which is that was it on 883 or 4, that bit you were just reading? Yeah, here. Indeed, we have. So you said like about the torpedo fish thing as being like not such a bad thing, like it's okay, he's going through a phase in learning. I think it's more than that. I think it's a necessary step. I think human beings just have this entrenched ego habit, whatever pattern of thinking, and it needs to be shocked. It needs to be paralyzed. I mean, without going way off track, sounds a little bit like the psychedelic assisted therapy, for example. Like whatever it is, it does something. It turns off the old pattern, and when the new pattern, well, when things start up again, they're malleable, and that's kind of what we got here. And then he says, and this is the bit again, I I just think it's so important. He says, just like you read it, indeed, we have probably achieved something relevant to finding out how matters stand. For now, as he does not know, he would be glad to find out. What does that mean? Again, it's motivational. He's now spurred on. He can learn. He's primed to learn. This is the first situation that boy's been in since God knows how long, where he realizes um, he desires to know more and that he's got access to knowing things. He could do it. He can learn. That's amazing. That's pivotal. That means it changes the course of a person's life at that point. That's why it's important. If you don't have a way of thinking of human psychology like that, it leads to this stunted growth, kind of this giving upness.
And so, yeah, Socrates says, has he then benefited from being numbed? I think so, Meno says. So, yeah, it's like, okay, that was a confronting experience, but it's also the necessary condition for making progress.
Uh, that it doesn't, as long as this beautiful yearning for learning, for overcoming one's ignorance is becomes entrenched through through what's happened here. Therefore, with that passion for learning, it doesn't really matter whether it is remembrance from before you were alive, that's carried in the soul, or whether it's taught to you by an external source, right? Because either way, you're still having that beautiful gift of learning, of making progress towards the good. And so, maybe that's where it is a gift, and that's why the final statement about it being a gift, Anyway,
What about the recollection of bad behavior and bad ideas?
That's just ignorance.
Sorry?
That's ignorance.
Oh, so you're not calling that recollection then?
No, that's just making a mistake. That's just
But,
relying on appearances.
but really, if the soul has been being born again and again, is imprinted with all this knowledge,
So in the
it's
next,
it's it's deceptive. It's not true knowledge, but it's some sort of knowledge, isn't it?
in the Phaedrus, is it the Phaedrus, which is the next one? He he talks about when the soul is born and it finds itself in a body and it's in a certain condition due to the senses and being bodied where it sees as if through a glass half darkly. So everything is distorted. So long as it relies too much, too heavily on the senses, it will confuse the nature of things and make mistakes and kind of um, fail to recollect.
Yeah, so that's ignorance.
Yeah, so you can see how
So
easy
so
it would be.
recollection would include all the aspects of memory of that are stored. Yes.
But it's done gradually. So you spend your life recollecting.
Yeah, but how's it if everything is stored within the continuum, how and ignorance is preventing you connecting with the truth?
Yes.
Um, I suppose depending on what you're taught, then you can then recollect the stuff that's inappropriate.
Well,
What we
that,
think to be wisdom is actually ignorance, like we were saying earlier.
well, is it like conscience? The word conscience comes to play there, doesn't it? I don't know. It's
Conscience.
that inner. Yeah, I don't know. It's a
well, I
hard
don't know
one.
if you can call learning bad things as recollecting bad things. Apparently, in the world of forms, it's closer to goodness, beauty, and truth. So there aren't bad things. There aren't wrong things.
But there are
Wrong.
wrong ideas about how we should behave and that.
They
That
don't
are,
exist in the world of the soul, apparently. And
which
and so, for example, you look at a flower, right, and you say it's a beautiful flower, and you smell it, and it's beautiful, and you say the flower's beautiful. But in this way of thinking, there's a form of the beautiful, and the flower partakes in the form of the beautiful. So it's
hmm.
almost like the flower is a door through which you open it and you encounter the recollection of the form, which is beautiful. It's not that the flower is beautiful at all.
Sure.
It just reminds you of the beautiful.
But if you sort of recollect, say, for example, you think women are less than men.
But that's just a mistake because all
Yeah, but that's
souls
but
are
that's something you're
genderless.
recollecting, though, isn't it?
No,
That's
no,
something that's imprinted within your soul.
no, 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 no.
That's
Why?
traditional. That's cultural.
That's learnt from culture. Yeah,
No, no, yeah, no. But if you've had many lifetimes, whatever cultures you would have been in would have been imprinted by that.
He's
Mm.
talking about the life
That's,
of the
Yeah.
soul.
Sorry?
He's
Yes.
talking about the life of the soul, not the bodied life, not the embodied life.
Okay, so what is the life of the soul then? I'm a bit confused.
He's really talking about this abstract, non-embodied, non-human, really, non-cultured, um, non-experiencing kind of human being that has a
Okay.
place in the world. He's talking about this eternal part of ourselves, which only knows abstract, eternal truths. We,
Metaphysical.
yeah,
Okay.
Metaphysical.
Okay.
Mm.
and they underpin everything that we see in the world now. They're the true reality. Everything we see now is just fleeting and an imitation and not what it appears to be at all. That kind of
Okay, so
idea.
we're not talking essentially about reincarnation, in having many embodied existence to which
Well,
we
we are actually talking about that. That's what Plato is talking about.
like so,
I think
yeah.
you're right, Alan, in the sense that in this schema, it's kind of conceivable that I mean, and in the Republic, remember in Book 10, some people or some human souls may be reincarnated as animals. So I think there's certainly scope for us to imagine that Plato was thinking that um, non-human perceptions might be ingrained in a soul.
Hmm.
And so, yes, there's no reason why erroneous conceptions might be ingrained, but that's just a function of whatever uh, embodied state that soul had partaken in.
I would be careful with that though. I mean, you might be right in general, but I think what he's doing here is using this idea um, very specifically. And that's why I think it's seen more in a sense like a story, like in rather than like a like an account of what might actually happen in reality, because I don't think he wants to create this kind of complication. I can't imagine why he'd want to create a complication like that. I think he's talking about before you were bodied, you lived countless eons as a disembodied soul. And at that time, you experienced everything that could be experienced in the life of the universe. You had access to all the forms, and then you were born, and
But
then things got complicated.
how could you experience everything when you weren't embodied? Because partly it would be the being embodied that you'd actually experience those things.
No, he's talking about forms, though, isn't he? He's not talking about real flowers and real experiences. He's talking about abstract things like mathematical principles and the like, and ethical principles, which are based on things that we can't know with the senses directly.
Hmm.
I mean, I think, Alan, there's certainly a lot of scope to conjecture as to what Plato was actually
Hmm.
thinking that was involved here. So, yeah, I think um, we need to be, open about what he thinks here. But yeah, I think certainly. So it's in the Phaedo, which is one of the dialogues where this is canvassed, and also in the Republic in Book 10.
Mm.
Yeah, certainly he seemed to think that, or at least he puts it forward that it's a possibility that souls are reincarnated,
Mm.
including in animal form,
Hmm.
depending on the conduct of the person person or animal in that particular lifetime. So I
Karma,
think,
essentially.
well, I don't know enough about Eastern concepts
Okay.
to know whether
Is
it
it
maps
possible?
onto karma.
But he
Yeah,
Is it
says
well,
that
possible
idea
to have
isn't, he says
to
that's an
con
older idea. That's a Pythagorean idea
mm.
that he's borrowing there.
Pythagorean and also Eastern? Like it's hard to imagine that he would have had contact with so many various people and travelers and philosophers and people of his day, and it's always a conjecture of mine that that there would have been Eastern ideas available to the
Sure.
West, and Western ideas available to the East.
But he says it in one of the texts. I remember it. He says this is an older idea from the whatever followers of Pythagoras, and
Pythagoras, yes.
and he's talking about I can't even remember which one it's in, but he's talking about the transmigration of the soul. Epictetus says similar things.
Yep.
But Epictetus doesn't mean it literally either. He doesn't think that I don't think that we could, he says, don't be like an animal. You don't want to turn into a wolf or a fox or a lion. But we know that they don't mean that literally. And I think the older ideas, the Pythagorean ideas, for example, are to be taken literally. And they're the kind of ideas that come up in these mystery traditions. But I think, as you know, at Plato, there's a pivot from the mythological to the whatever you want to call it, the rational, the psychological, where I think some of these ideas start to get used in a completely different way. He grounds them somehow. I mean, anyway, that's just what I think.
I quite enjoyed the end of this section with the squares because it sets up two different ideas. And we have the first common one where we might look at this and say, well, if Socrates is asking questions, you would view it as he is guiding someone to discover new information. So you would know the basics of what a square is and how to double it. And then we go through this process, and through questions and coaching and guidance, we're able to come to new knowledge, and we can make it a diagonal square to get it double. But then at the end, it's around, well, actually, this argument that is, if you're recollecting, you have this knowledge and it's come from within you. So that means you've acquired it at some point. Therefore, we've had to have it forever because we haven't acquired it during the life you're living now. So the truth about it is that it's been in our soul forever. The soul must be ever living. And that means if there's something you happen not to know right now, rather you haven't recollected, you mustn't be afraid to try and find out about it. So I quite enjoyed that phrase. It's a very sharp distinction around learning versus this approach here around actually we need to be very adventurous and be quite motivated to go recollect everything that we can.
I agree. But following that right here where you are, Judith, B, he says, Meno says, somehow, Socrates, I think that what you say is right. And I think this is the point too. He says, I think so too, Meno. I do not insist that my argument is right in all other respects, but I would contend at all costs, both in word and deed, as far as I could, that we will be better men, braver and less idle, if we believe that one must search for the things one does not know, rather than if we believe that it is not possible to find out what we do not know and that we must not look for it. I think right there he's saying, look, I don't necessarily believe the story, all of it, but what I'm interested in is what will spur a person on to finding out the truth.
Yeah, I think you're right, Courtney. And I think this also may be, and this has just occurred to me, also may kind of get over the difficulty in Stoicism, which is, kind of raised sometimes that, well, we're never going to be sages, so why should we have any effort towards the good at all? So I'd say this is why. It's because in order to become as good as we can as people, we should be learning throughout our time here as much as we can to be as good a human being as we can be. So I think this kind of, it is a very powerful principle and gets us over that apparent problem with the Stoic sage being the only instantiation of a virtuous person, as well as our everyday kind of inertia. It's incumbent on us to keep learning.
Yeah, and we need to have a belief that spurs us on, not blocks us. Simple as that. Like, I think it's really interesting because a lot of people say things like, "Oh, I'm just going to challenge my beliefs. But people, when they talk about it like that, they're talking about very surface, superficial beliefs. What often holds people back the most is these deep down, deeply held beliefs about even metaphysical beliefs, you know? So how do you change those? That's exactly what Socrates is getting at. Like, if you really want to have the energy to keep going, then you're going to have to challenge your beliefs at a very fundamental level.
And that brings us to this next sort of phase, which now Meno's been, brought to this point. He's ready to say, he's ready to return to this original question he had when he was in a somewhat different frame of mind, whether we should try on the assumption that virtue is something teachable, or is it a natural gift, or in whatever way it comes to men. So we're back to square one in a sense, but we've come a long way in the meantime.
And basically, if it can be taught, I mean, if it's a knowledge, it can be taught. I'm just going off memory here. But it doesn't seem like anyone's teaching it, we've kind of discovered. So if there's no one teaching it, then there's no students of it. And if there's no students of it, then maybe it's not a knowledge at all. And then he starts, so if it's, given that problem, let's think about it from the other point of view. Like, maybe it's not a knowledge. Maybe it's something else.
But first of all, we've got to decide, was it beneficial? Which kind of seems obvious, but we've got to accept that first and then say, well, what kind of things benefit us? And then determine, well, some of those things that we might think are benefits are actually sometimes could harm us. And so those, in a sense, are what the Stoics would then call indifference. If something is able to both benefit or harm depending on the situation, then it's not actually a good, and it's not virtue.
Yeah, he really brings a paradox in here for me, that really big paradox. And he puts me on my backside here with that idea that, if you can't find people that teach it, is it even teachable anyway? Because then they together look across the whole vast array of the types of teachers that are possible, and they both agree really that no one's very good at it. Yeah.
How do you think the Stoics get around this problem? I've got my own hunch. What do you guys think? Because there's another way to learning things other than being taught something.
Well, I think that's kind of being hinted at here, although it's not explicit. And it kind of comes to what is this is what's going on here. Socrates is in the process. This is in real time. Socrates is actually teaching in real time, and he's teaching Meno in real time what it is to investigate something in a committed way. So yeah, it's to do with example, and this is this comes up again and again in different dialogues. It's Socrates' example. It's the way he is, the way he lives. That is what is the example that teaches people. And so this is actually an interesting point too at the bottom of page 888 to 889. So if we're to, are there people who are good by nature? Are there children that we can point to and say, oh yeah, that's a good one. That's a special person. He says, well, we would take those children and guard them in the Acropolis and seal them up there so that no one could corrupt them. And when they reach maturity, they would be useful to their cities. Well, that's a kind of bizarre idea, but it also underscores that when we're talking about children, well, they're just children, they're not they're not in a complete form as they are. And whether on, I mean, and it's kind of an interesting idea that can lead to a lot of different reflections, but we don't take children to be gifted with goodness by nature. We see them as uh, what are they? Children, children are humans who are learning how to be in the world, and they're learning how to get on with other humans, and they're learning how to improve their own skills, but they are not evidently good as in a kind of a sacred way. So this is what Socrates is saying. He's saying if there were those children who would be obviously I suppose an interesting counterexample is the Tibetan children who are designated as lamas at a young age and then set aside to be that person in perpetuity. That's a kind of a counterexample. And I don't know how those children are chosen, but this, that's kind of a real life counterexample to this idea from Socrates. So it's absurd to think that we would choose a child and set them aside because at that stage they are not virtuous people. Evidently, they have to develop that. They have to learn. They have to develop and mature in order to be virtuous.
Even those Tibetan children, which are tukus, supposedly reincarnated lamas, still show the aspect they have to actually learn to maybe connect with that recollection of what they've done before.
It's a bit like the old nature nurture debate, just, they've been having it forever, haven't they? He's saying, can it be taught, or are you just born like that?
I think it's a bit of each, isn't there?
A few sections up, there was an important point that I think helped set the tone for the rest of this discussion, and it's the development of a hypothesis. So what we're kind of looking at now is whether or not what we're talking about being good can be taught. And it was just a good reminder to me around, well, sometimes a hypothesis can be a good thing if we're trying to discover something, because we're saying, well, can being good be taught? We say, well, being good will turn out to be teachable or unteachable if what? And then we figure out that teachable can be true if it's a knowledge. So then our hypothesis is if it's a kind of knowledge, then it can be taught. And if it isn't, then it can't. So then now we're thinking about, well, is this something that can be taught or not in the context of knowledge?
Yeah, and Socrates gives a whole bunch of classic examples. He talks about a whole bunch of powerful individuals, Athenian individuals, when he's talking to Anytus, after Anytus well, no, this is just before Anytus threatens him. He says, he talks about Themistocles, and he talks about, I can't remember all of them, Pericles. And basically, the point he's making is these people had access to money, the best teachers, all the resources, and their children turned out to be pretty average. So, if it could be taught, why didn't they teach that to their kid? Did they have some sort of ulterior motive? They didn't want their kid to be as good as them? He's being a bit cheeky. And then Anytus gets the shits with him, basically, and says, I think, Socrates, that you easily speak ill of people. I would advise you, if you will listen to me, to be careful. Perhaps also in another city, and certainly here, it is easier to injure people than to benefit them. And I think you know that for yourself.
Yeah, and Socrates is completely unfazed, right? He just carries right on. But he does make a good point, and this is something that, as parents, obviously, is of considerable interest to us. We all want our children to learn what they need to do in order to be productive and virtuous people. I mean, that's obviously got to be one of our prime concerns as parents, and yet. Great men who also were parents, such as Themistocles and Pericles, were not able to attain that in the case of their own children, for whom they, spared no expense or any effort. And this is a really important kind of I suppose, consideration around this whole issue of whether virtue is teachable. It's a real life, real world cases of parents who just weren't able to ensure that their own children were virtuous. I mean, of course, Marcus Aurelius is, of course, the paradigm case, right? His heir and only surviving son, Commodus, was a terrible person. So it's not just that virtuous parents have been proven unable to convey that in their children. In some cases, the results have been absolutely disastrous. And of course, in Socrates' own case, his own children were, mediocre at best, and his star student, Alcibiades, was an absolute disaster for Athens. No two ways about it. So, yeah, these are very salient matters for all of us who care about the next generation.
But if the concern is approaching knowledge or the approach to knowledge, I think that's what makes sense of Socrates' response to Anytus. He says, I think, Meno, that Anytus is angry, and I am not at all surprised. And this is the important bit, right? He says, he thinks, to begin with, that I am slandering those men, and then he believes himself to be one of them. If he ever realizes what slander is, he will cease from anger, but he does not know it now. See, what he's alluding to, I think, there is slander is just telling the truth. It's just a matter of being honest and open. And he's only angry because his status and reputation and his preconceptions are on the line. But if he cared about the truth, then he wouldn't see it as slander. He would see it as an opportunity to learn.
It's interesting that Anytus is so horrified by the idea of any young person being taught by the sophists, and that his answer to it all was that the gentlemen, the gentlemen are the teachers. So anyway.
I think it raised a good point though, because it's coming down to different categories that things can be taught to people how it's viewed, because we might take the idea then that, well, if you're a good person, you're setting an example and then that's how people learn. But then if we look at a technique or a skill set, we readily accept the idea that you can be a great shoemaker, but not be able to pass that knowledge down or facilitate or guide someone to do it. So there are some differences there as well around how, knowledge can be transmitted or how we can teach and learn. So I thought it was interesting because it kind of leaves out the idea around, well, people can actually be good facilitators, or you cannot be a good facilitator, and that can impact how someone learns. Comes down to that example through Epictetus, where he's like, well, would you rather go to the surgeon who's going to tell you in detail and 100% correctly how this operation is going to work, or would you rather go to the one that can't really tell you, but has performed it successfully like 100 times? It's just these different ways that you can then transmit some of that knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. I see we're running out of time quickly. If you quickly go to 895, he offers a solution. So it's either virtue's knowledge or it's not knowledge. They've got that far. And then, after Anytus gets the shits, him and Meno continue to discuss it. And they go, look, it just means that we don't really know what virtue is. But here's another solution. He says, basically, what if someone had had a correct opinion as to which was the way, but had not gone there, nor indeed had knowledge of it? Would he not also lead correctly? Certainly. And as long as he has the right opinion about that of which the other has knowledge, he will not be a worse guide than the one who knows, as he has a true opinion, though not knowledge. In no way worse, says the other guy. Socrates says, so true opinion is in no way a worse guide to correct action than knowledge. it is this that we omitted in our investigation of the nature of virtue when we said that only knowledge can lead to correct action, but true opinion can do so also. So it seems. So there's a kind of softer middle, which is true opinion. You can have someone or something that offers knowledge, and you might not have knowledge, but so long as you rely on that, you can end up doing what is the equivalent of virtuous action because you have right opinion on your side.
Yeah, and then there's this very famous image of the statues of Daedalus, the great craftsman. And his statues apparently had the name that, they might just get up and run around because they're so beautiful and lifelike. And that's what opinions are like. But opinions, even if they're true, are not grounded in good accountability in the same way as knowledge is. So that's a very famous image.
There's
And
an
so
important
Socrates
line in there
concludes.
too. Before you get
Which
on,
one?
there's a really important line. If I'm pushing my little wheelbarrow, it says here, just like the Daedalus statues that, are going to fly away, that's exactly the problem with opinion or true opinion. It's no good just to have this thought because it'll just fly away. So what you got to do is you got to pin it down with an account. So the point is, it doesn't have to be true. It has to tie down the thing, the true opinion. It has to tie it down adequately. And that's why I think it's not really a big deal about whether the story is entirely accurate or not. It's that it's an account that anchors it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's a kind of a best kind of available approach here because and he comes to this conclusion that these great men like Themistocles and Pericles, they didn't necessarily have knowledge, but their true opinion were able to benefit the city. And so that's helpful.
Isn't
And
it?
in fact, Socrates wants to go ahead and call them divine, these great men. We should be right to call divine also those soothsayers and prophets whom we just mentioned, and all the poets. And we should call no less divine and inspired those public men who are no less under the gods' influence and possession, as their speeches lead to success in many important matters, though they have no knowledge of what they are saying. So that's kind of a curious conclusion, right? That they might have this divine endorsement in a sense, even though they're perhaps not really knowing what they're doing. And Meno kind of gets that it's a bit dodgy here. He says, oh, they appear to be right, Socrates, so perhaps Anytus will be annoyed with you for saying so. So yeah, and so this idea of divinity, these people who are someone like Pericles, who's this gifted statesman, someone who's gifted, right? We call them gifted because we don't know where it comes from. And in a sense, this is what Socrates is saying. He's saying it's coming from the gods, it's divine. These people have this gift, this is what we say about very talented sports people or musicians or whatever. We say they have a gift. Well, where's the gift come from? Well, it's kind of mysterious in a sense, and that's what he's getting at. It's a gift from the gods. And even Meno, who's become this, all his kind of arrogance has disappeared and he's now just wanting to contribute. Socrates suggests that even Meno can kind of maybe try and work on Anytus so he's less kind of annoying and aggressive. And that would be a good gift to the Athenians.
There you go. We finished with 1 minute over. Not bad. Well done. Jeez. So that gives you an idea. If we're reading something that's 60 pages, we're going to have to split it into 3 parts, basically, pretty much. Well, anyway, did we answer any of our questions? I think so. I think we explored lots of interesting stuff there. Is there anything that feels left unsaid? in 1 or 2 minutes? Is there anything that you feel a burning desire to say? How about you, Alan? I could tell you were really curious about the Buddhist angle here, and I'm not sure if there was one, but
Yeah, well, there's some interesting parallels in terms of the progression from what they call wrong consciousness to truth. So you're holding on to a wrong idea, and then you try and counter that, which is similar to this with a reductio absurdum, a consequence, to shatter someone's view, which is what was something like that in the text. And then when you shatter their view, they start doubting what they held. Then you start doubting it against the fact. Then you have equal doubt. Then you have doubt tending towards the fact. And then the next stage is correct assumption, which I think you were talking about this sort of valid, what do you call it? Valid belief or something? Um, and that is not supported by anything. There's no logic to support that. And then the next stage is inference, which is supported by logic. And then there's direct experience, which goes beyond logic. So that sort of parallels a little bit within that text. So
And I guess in the wider context of the Hellenistic world, Judith would be able to say more about that, no doubt, is that there's a lot of different schools having very sophisticated arguments about how a person can know anything at all, whether you can trust the senses, what is good, what's not good. And yeah, so they're all arguing about very similar things to what you're talking about in various different ways, whether usually reason plays an important part in the Greek world, maybe less so in the Eastern world.
uh, yeah, well, certainly in the Tibetan tradition, there's enormous amount of logic. They do a lot of debating.
Okay, yeah.
That's what they like in the monasteries, they would do probably about 20 hours a week debating using syllogisms and consequences.
Oh, there you go. We're often given the impression that they have some sort of I don't know, that the world's not real and so on and so forth. But I guess that's a different thing altogether.
I was
But
just going to ask, Alan, do you read Tibetan?
Do I read Tibetan?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I read translations. Yeah, I don't. I haven't gone that step of learning Tibetan. Yeah, so I've just relied on English translations and things like that. Yeah, yeah.
be very interesting.
And interesting, like virtue, very much within the Buddhist tradition will be based on intention.
Hmm.
Just pure intention. Intention will be deciding whether something's virtuous or not.
But we do that too, don't we? Because it's like you're either a consequentialist or a utilitarian or or a ethics into virtue ethics. So the Stoics would be more into intention, surely. You were going to talk to that for a moment, Courtney, about the Stoic view on
Me, no, jeez.
learning and
The time's up.
okay. Those questions, there's a lot there to chew over, those questions too.
Well, I guess the other way to do it is if you get some brilliant ideas, put it in the Facebook page and we can talk about it. That's
Yep.
the other way too.
Mm.
Anyway, it was wonderful to see everyone again and very stimulating conversation. I love sharing this stuff because when I read it, I don't have half the thoughts I have when I'm reading it than when we're discussing it. So I find that it's just wonderful to share with everyone. So, and I hope you feel the same way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, guys and gals, have a good night. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks so
You
much.
too. Good
See you
night,
all.
everyone.
Goodbye.